Welcome to week 3 of the Sustainability Teachers Academy online. I'm here with Molly Cashin.
Hello.
This is Rob McGeehee, and we are going to be talking about how you can prevent a plague of locusts of biblical proportions with sheep.
Sheep.
So we're going to start, Molly, with a small diversion from the locust track that we've been following. And I want to tell you about the Inuit paradox. Have you ever heard about this?
I haven't, but I have a feeling that it might be related.
It is, yeah. It's related to locust in a roundabout fashion.
All right.
So here's the Inuit paradox. So what do Inuits eat? They're in these really harsh, cold, frozen regions of the world. And what do you suppose most of their diet is?
I would guess mostly animals.
Yes, correct.
Because they can't grow
food
in cold climates.
They're hunter-gatherers. They don't have, traditionally don't have an established form of agriculture. And they eat a lot of animals that are adjusted and adapted to living in the cold areas that they're from. Here's a description of a typical diet of traditional foods by an Inupiat woman named Patricia Cochran. She says, "Our meat was seals and walruses, marine mammals that live in cold water and have lots of fat. We use seal oil for our cooking as well as dipping. Sauces for food. We had moose, caribou, and reindeer. We hunted ducks, geese, and little birds called ptarmigans. We caught crab and lots of fish, salmon, whitefish, tomcod, pike, and char. Our fish were cooked, dried, smoked, and frozen. We ate frozen raw whitefish, sliced thin. The elders like stinkfish." Molly, have you ever had stinkfish?
I haven't even heard of it, no.
It's fish that's been buried in seal bags or in cans in the tundra and then left to ferment.
What do you mean seal bags? Like bags made out of seals? Is this like a turducken situation?
Like where there's a seal stuffed with stinkfish?
Yeah.
Possibly. I assume, yes, it's a bag made out of seals. And then they also ate fermented seal flipper. All of that, of course, sounds really, really high in fat and oil and potentially salt as well. So if you were to compare that to a typical American diet, what do you think? Is an American diet healthier for you, or would you rather eat the traditional Inupiat diet?
Well, when we're talking about the traditional American diet, it's SAD, the standard American diet. And just from the acronym, I'm wondering if maybe the Inuit diet might be better for us, because the standard American diet has a lot of issues.
Yeah, right. So people who have been born and raised on the American diet have high rates of diabetes. They have typically are overweight or even obese in many cases. Something like 33% of all Americans are in the obese category. They often eat way more calories than they need, lots of refined sugars, lots of carbohydrates and things like that. And so there's a lot that goes on along with that kind of diet.
I'm interested here because the standard American diet, yes, there's a lot of processed foods, but it's also very meat heavy. That's something we've talked about a little bit before in sustainability. But it seems like this Inuit diet is very meat heavy, more so.
Yeah, and so there's sort of a little bit of a push right now by people like Michael Pollan and others who say things like, your diet, a healthy diet, should be lots of variety, mostly plants, and lean meats only, right? And so that stands in direct contradiction to what the traditional Inuit diet would be. And so they had also very little plant material. There's not a ton of plants that they can cultivate, not even a ton of plants that grow in the Arctic. So that's absolutely, very, very different from what dietitians, nutritionists, etc., modern nutritionists would tell us that we should eat. And so
not to mention the vegans.
Yeah, not to mention the vegans, the raw foodists. Now, maybe you could get away with eating raw blubber.
Yeah, or the stinkfish.
The stinkfish, the fermented stinkfish.
Yeah, or fermented foods are supposed to be very good for you.
That's what I've heard. Western diets have a major benefit over some traditional diets in that they have a range of vitamins that are important. So, for example, vitamin A. Do you know what that's for?
Eyes and bones.
Yes,
right.
It's from carotenoids,
like
which
carrots?
are pigments, that are found in carrots.
Is that why they always say if you eat more carrots, you'll be good for your eyes?
Yes, that's what they say. That's true.
Is that why you don't wear glasses anymore, because you eat a lot of carrots?
Yes, that's why I don't wear glasses anymore. Also, I just keep leaving them places, and then I forget them. Another vitamin that's important is vitamin D. We don't necessarily eat that unless you have a vitamin D deficiency, for example. But most Americans live in a climate where they have pretty decent exposure to sunlight. And being exposed to sunlight allows you to absorb ultraviolet light, and that helps your liver to process vitamin D. That's good for your bones. So if you don't have vitamin D, you can have some problems with bone density and bone growth.
My doctor told me that I have the highest vitamin D content of anyone that he's ever seen that's not on vitamin D supplements.
That's amazing. That's like one of those superhero powers
Yeah.
that like normal everyday superhero powers. If I had a superhero power, it would be the ability to clean up really disgusting, smelly messes because I have no sense of smell. So I'll clean something up that's really smelly and my wife will be like, oh, I can't stand it. I can't be in this room with this whatever smelly thing is going on. And I'm like, I don't even notice it. So
I mean, I have high vitamin D because I commute. And so I'm walking outside a lot and I'm on the light rail a lot. And unlike some people, I don't like put a ton of sunscreen on.
Right. And so for the Inuit, this is a particular challenge because of not only their location on the globe where they have sort of low or sort of indirect sunlight for most of the year or low exposure to sunlight, but also it's freezing up there. And so they're bundled up in clothing so they don't get a ton of exposure to natural sunlight. Their skin doesn't get exposed to sunlight very, very much. And then finally, vitamin C. Have you heard that vitamin C is good for you if you happen to be a pirate? Do you know why?
Because it prevents scurvy.
Yeah, it does. It prevents, it's pronounced scurvy.
Scurvy.
It's pronounced scurvy. And it's found in citrus and other fruits. What's interesting about vitamin C is that humans and our ape relatives, like chimpanzees, for example, we can't produce our own vitamin C, but most mammals can. Do you know what other mammals can't produce their own vitamin C?
I don't.
Besides apes?
No, I don't. I don't actually know, and I didn't know that at all.
Yeah,
That's really interesting.
Most mammals can produce it. There are some bats that can't produce it, and then guinea pigs. Guinea pigs can't produce their own vitamin C. So animals that can't produce their own vitamin C have to eat vitamin C in large quantities or larger quantities. So we get it from fruit. So one of the reasons that apes are able to thrive despite the fact that they don't have access or they can't produce their own vitamin C is that they have access to fruits. Fruits is a major part of the diet of most apes, and so they can replace the vitamin C that they're not producing.
There's also an interesting misconception with vitamin C that oranges have a ton of vitamin C, and they actually don't have that much vitamin C.
Just enough to keep you from getting scurvy. which is a terrifying disease. Like I don't know what you thought scurvy was. Maybe you thought that it was just like getting bow-legged, or maybe your teeth would fall out. But apparently, it's this connective tissue disease.
Oh,
and
no,
so if you don't get enough vitamin C, you can start to have joint pain. Your gums start to rot. Eventually, you have leaky blood vessels, which that sounds
terrible.
That sounds really messy.
Just using the term leaky.
Yeah, for any part of your
anything.
body. Yeah, for any part of your body. It's
terrible.
problematic.
God.
Leaky blood vessels, physical and mental degradation, and so this is a disease that was terrible and plagued European and American expeditions even into the 20th century. And one of the problems with vitamin C is that you can maybe you can freeze some lemons or you can store citrus, but it starts to lose the vitamin C content, starts to degrade.
Kiwis actually have 50 times more vitamin C.
Kiwi's the bird?
No, kiwi's the fruit. Kiwi's the fruit. Have 50 times more vitamin C than oranges.
I was going to say that's problematic because kiwis are endangered.
Yeah, no.
And they're also only found in New Zealand.
Maybe I should use their original name, the Chinese gooseberry.
And then I would never know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
and I couldn't make a joke.
Would.
Yeah. That'd be like Chinese gooseberry's the bird.
Doesn't have the same flow.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Failed jokes. The Inuit paradox is how is it that this group of people that are specially adapted to live in really harsh environments and have access to mostly animal food, lots of protein, lots of fat, but not a lot of plant material, how is it that they are able to get what their bodies need so that they can survive? And part of it is that they're eating animals, parts of animals that probably the average American doesn't eat, like fats and lots of the organs, especially the liver. And so one of the things that happens is when you're eating parts of animals like that, you end up absorbing or taking in those vitamins that uh, you may not find in your environment very well. So if you're eating an animal's liver, for example, you might get vitamin D instead of having to be exposed to sunlight to produce it.
It's really interesting. I wonder if it's because the animals produce their own vitamin D.
Or they may be eating something that's high in vitamin D themselves. Okay. So here's what's really interesting. The simplest and fastest way for your body to make energy is to convert carbohydrates into glucose, which is blood sugar, which is your body's primary fuel, right?
Right.
But if your body has no carbs, what does it do?
It burns fat. That's why people exercise.
Yeah, right. Or that's why they diet, right? So you get through, you burn all the carbs and then you can start to use fat. Or if necessary, your body can actually break down proteins and create glucose. It's a process called gluconeogenesis, and it happens in your liver. And there are a couple of problems. You end up producing lots of nitrogenous waste that has to be gotten rid of through your urine. And that can put some strain on your kidneys. So there's problems with Americans consuming way too much protein. For example, I was in a phase where I was working out a lot with weights and I was drinking like protein shakes, and I ended up having problems with my liver and kidney. Then my doctor was like, "What are you doing?" And I told him, and he was like, "Don't ever do that anymore. You get enough protein."
That's really interesting. I mean, I've been a vegetarian and on and off, and people are always like, "Well, what about your protein?" And I always kind of knew that you didn't need as much protein as other people, but I didn't realize that having so much excess of it was a problem.
My doctor told me that a typical American takes in more protein than he or she actually needs. So it's a huge part of our diet that we may not actually need. Are
you telling me that being a vegetarian is feasible?
Yeah, it's not only is it feasible, but it might also be the sustainable thing to do. You should
love vegetarian food.
Become a vegetarian.
All the way.
All right. Currently not a vegetarian.
No. Yeah, it's the bacon problem. I could be a vegetarian, EBB, everything but bacon.
Yeah, or as I like to say, vegetarian plus. Oh. I'm vegetarian plus, I eat vegetarian food plus bacon.
Nice.
Okay. So the people who live in the Arctic, who survive on these traditional diets, have tons and tons of protein, not a lot of carbohydrates. So they often have to use gluconeogenesis. And if you look at their bodies, they have adaptations for this. They have much bigger livers, so they can handle the strain of needing to break down protein into glucose. And they have lots more urine. They produce more urine than average. And that's the way that they can get rid of the excess nitrogen.
That is fascinating. How do they measure that?
I imagine they just have them urinate into a cup.
But what about, I drink a ton of water.
Oh, I see what you're asking.
Yeah.
How do they measure it overall?
Right.
No idea.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm sure there's some
really
kind of very scientific process for this.
Right.
So one problem, though, is that if you are eating too much protein, you can actually get protein poisoning. You can have that protein overwhelm your body's systems for getting rid of the excess nitrogen. And when that happens, you start to get nauseous and you may have diarrhea, and eventually you might actually waste away or even die. And early pioneers and trappers in North America often encountered this affliction that they sometimes called rabbit starvation, because rabbit meat is really, really lean. So if you're eating lots of rabbit meat and you don't have a lot of other plant material in your diet, a lot of carbohydrates in your diet, you can end up dying from your body's inability to create glucose efficiently from all of that protein. You can overload your body's gluconeogenesis system. So Molly, the Inuit paradox is all about how can this group of people be so well adapted to eating lots and lots of protein. We already know they have some anatomical and physiological adaptations, but how can they adapt to eating so much protein? What is it that makes that diet work for them?
So it's low in carbohydrates, but there's something else going on here. You said earlier that as kind of a last result or a secondary result, if you don't have enough carbohydrates to break down into glucose, you can break down fat. So because the animals that they're eating are also in the Arctic zones, they have a lot of blubber. that's very different from the rabbit diet because it's not lean meats, it's very fat meats.
Right. The key difference and the key to having a high protein diet that's low in carbohydrates is to also make sure that you're eating a high fat diet. A typical Inuit diet gets more than 50% of its calories from fats.
50% is a ton.
Yeah.
That's so much.
I know.
It's crazy because it just seems so counterintuitive.
Right.
Like, especially when we're talking about dieting and what's good for the body. So, like, you be eating so much, like 50% of your calories are coming from fat. That seems crazy.
Right. And so it's not just the matter of being able to consume fats. It's also the types of fats they're consuming. Specifically, it's fat that comes from wild animals. So I'm sure you've heard nutritionists talk about the food pyramid and how we need to limit the amount of fats that we get in our diet.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
So that's generally true, but one of the things that is important to remember is that not all fats are the same. So for example, the fat that they are consuming from blubber and fat in adorable Arctic animals is actually saturated fat. Whereas when we have fat in an American diet, it's typically from things like olive oil or partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. That's stuff that they offer as an alternative to butter. And that stuff is monounsaturated fats, which are actually bad for you in a lot of cases. Way worse for you than if you were eating animal fats, for example.
Why are they bad for you?
So for a number of reasons. They often increase your bad cholesterol while decreasing your good cholesterol. And some of our processed food is also heavy in trans fats, these re-engineered vegetable oils and shortenings that can also do damage in addition to affecting the types of cholesterol your body produces. But the Inuit diet contains fat from cold water fish and sea mammals, and their fat is really rich in polyunsaturated fats like omega-3 fatty acids, which you probably have heard is a good supplement for some dietary conditions.
Yeah, you see it in like fish oil.
Yeah, and their fat happens to have a benefit to heart and vascular health. And then there's one other key to why it is that their food from animals is better for you than perhaps the food that you might consume, the animal products that you might consume from our industrial farm system. And it has to do with what the animals eat. What do you think about that?
When we raise animals for food production, we typically have a very strict diet that they consume in order to maximize the yield. So lots of corn and soybeans and grass, but it's all like one kind of food. It's very standard one kind of food. In thinking about wild animals, for example, deer hunting in Tennessee, where I'm from, they eat a lot of different stuff.
Animals in the wild have a much broader diet than animals that we raise in industrial agriculture. And as a result, their bodies contain a wider variety of compounds.
Are you telling me that you are what you eat?
Essentially, yes. I'm telling you, you are what you eat. So if you need something like vitamin D in higher concentrations, then you are probably going to have to eat a wider range of animals that have eaten a wider range of things in order to get that vitamin D. And so not only is their diet rich in protein and fat, but it's also rich in a variety of chemicals that are actually somewhat difficult for us to get from the industrially produced meats that we get. So you couldn't emulate the Inuit diet just by eating lots of hamburgers, right? You actually have to eat a much more varied diet than the Inuits do because the hamburger meat that you eat is so poor in nutrients that compared to the wild animals that they're eating.
But if you had a different kind of hamburger, so if you made a hamburger
out of walrus,
yeah,
if you had a walrus
burger,
yeah, then you might not
one step closer.
You might be one step closer to having the Inuit, the success that the Inuits have had with their high protein and high fat diet. We have mentioned a couple times how you can use sheep to prevent plagues of biblical proportions. And today we're going to talk more about how it is that that's even possible. And it's analogous to the conversation that we just had about the diet of the Inuits. In order to dive into this in a little more depth, we have to talk about something called biological stoichiometry. Did you take stoichiometry as part of your chemistry class in high school or college, Molly?
I may have, but I probably forgot it.
I also took stoichiometry, but for me, this part of chemistry made the most sense, like way more sense than any other part of chemistry. And I was super enthusiastic and I had a lot of fun doing it. And other kids in my class were like, what do why do you get this thing, but you don't get any of the other stuff in chemistry? So I'm sort of like an idiot savant when it comes to biological stoichiometry. But basically, stoichiometry is balancing chemical equations. Do you remember doing this where you have a molecule of H2O and you're going to combine it with some CO2 and you're going to get glucose? Now you got to figure out how many molecules of water you need and how many molecules of CO2 and how many molecules of glucose you're going to get.
Right. Yeah. I love balancing equations.
Yeah. So the photosynthesis equation, that's a typical example of biological stoichiometry. Stoichiometry is all about balancing chemical equations, and living things balance chemical equations when they do things like produce sugar via photosynthesis.
Or like ATP.
Yeah, or when they create ATP. Do you remember the balanced chemical equation for photosynthesis?
Not off the top of my head.
Well, so most people will remember the chemical equation for photosynthesis as being like you take some CO2, you take some water, and you use light to make glucose and you get some oxygen.
Right. Well, I got that, but I couldn't balance it. I don't know how much of each.
Right.
I know the basic formula, but not the specific recipe.
Right. So that's where stoichiometry comes in. Stoichiometry is about telling you how many molecules of each thing you're going to need. And so for photosynthesis, you need 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of H2O, and then you will get 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. That's a balanced equation, and the way that we know about that is because of stoichiometry. So biological stoichiometry is the study of the balanced equations of energy and chemical elements in living systems. It applies that balanced equation process to entire ecosystems.
So there are scientists going around and balancing equations, not only for ATP production in your cell or photosynthesis in a plant, but whole ecosystems.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're monitoring not just the flow of energy through an ecosystem, but the actual flow of elements through the ecosystem too. And so what scientists have learned about the organisms in an ecosystem through studying biological stoichiometry is that different kinds of organisms have different combinations or ratios of elements. So for example, if you took a locust and you ground it up and you analyzed it for its carbon content and its nitrogen content, what you'd find is that for every 5 molecules of carbon, you'd have 1 molecule of nitrogen. However, if you took some grass and did the same thing, you'd find 33 carbons for every 1 nitrogen.
It seems really out of balance.
It is. So can you imagine what happens when something like a grasshopper is relying on grasses for the chemicals that make up its body?
So I see that grass has way more carbon to nitrogen ratio than locusts do. What does that mean?
Yeah, so in order to...
I know it's not balanced, but I don't know how to balance it.
Right. So in order to sort of think about this, we're going to make some Christmas cookies. And as you know, I'm a type A personality and I have to have everything just perfect. Every cookie is going to have 5 red sprinkles and 1 white sprinkle.
All right. Kind of like a locust.
Yeah. So if I just give you a bowl of sprinkles and you know in that bowl that for every 33 red sprinkles, there's 1 white sprinkle.
Okay.
What is that going to mean after you're done making cookies?
There's going to be a whole bunch of red sprinkles.
Yeah, you're going to have way more red sprinkles than you are going to have white sprinkles left over.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, right? So this happens to locusts as well. When they're taking in nutrients from the grasses that they eat, they have to have a way to get rid of all of the excess carbon. They're going to have to hold on to the nitrogen and then get rid of any of the excess carbon that they take in. And that means that they're going to have to get rid of it in their poop. They're going to have their excretory system helping out, which means that they're going to breathe away some of the excess carbon, or their kidneys are going to get rid of it through their urine, or they're going to metabolize it, which means that they're going to just burn through that carbon really quickly and get rid of it that way. One of the challenges for a locust is that plants can actually have a really, really wide range of ratios of carbon to nitrogen. And so on the low end, they may have, 5 to 10 carbons for every 1 nitrogen, but on the high end, they might actually have greater than 100 carbons for every 1 nitrogen. But even within one species of plant, there can be lots and lots of variation. So within that one species, you can have a huge range from very low carbon to very high carbon. So if you're a grasshopper and you have to have 5 carbons for every 1 nitrogen in your body, but you're in an environment where the amount of carbon and nitrogen is going to change depending on lots of variables, what does that mean for your ability to eat and get the nutrients that you need?
You have to figure out ways to get rid of the excess carbons.
Yeah, and you have to be really good at adapting to the environment. But that's really hard because if you're consuming, if you're just eating and munching away at grass, and that grass is relatively low in carbon, and your body is adapting to getting rid of carbon in that way, when you switch diets to grass that is really high in carbon, you might actually have a harder time getting rid of that excess carbon. That might cause you to grow more slowly, or it might make it harder for you to reproduce, or it might even result in a higher mortality rate. And so locusts, who are specialized to eating grasses of a certain nutrient content, when environmental conditions change, that may make it harder for them to survive, or it might actually result in population explosions, depending on what those conditions are like.
I had no idea that so much depended on the carbon-nitrogen ratio in grasses.
Yeah, it's really crazy. And not just grasses, but lots and lots of other autotrophs too. So we're talking about other kinds of plants, but we're also talking about algae and bacteria that are all using photosynthesis, and they can vary greatly depending upon the conditions of the environment in which they live. And so not only does it impact consumers, primary consumers like grasshoppers who are eating the autotrophs, the plants or the bacteria or whatever, it can also change the whole way that energy is transferred through the food system. So when plants have a high ratio of carbon to nitrogen, meaning that they're really, really carbon rich, that's generally tough for other animals in the ecosystem to consume because they have to get rid of so much carbon. And this pushes or changes the way that energy flows through the system, and may make it harder for other consumers like grasshoppers and the animals that eat them to make a living in that environment. The ecosystem changes to favor things like decomposers. So the plants grow and grow and grow, and when they die or when their leaves fall off, those get decomposed and broken down by things like funguses and bacteria.
So we're only looking at like one little thing here. We're only looking at like the carbon to nitrogen and the grass and the locust, but it includes the whole ecosystem. Like it has huge implications, even though we're just talking about these 2 things.
Right. And it changes the way that energy and matter flow through the entire ecosystem. So when plants have much higher ratios of carbon to nitrogen, which means that they have lots of carbon and very little protein, it makes it harder for animals that eat them to survive. And if they're not surviving well, then it actually impacts the animals that eat the plants, and so on. And
all the way up the food web.
Yeah, all the way up the food chain. And in fact, when scientists have experimentally increased the amount of nitrogen in algae and plants that they collected from the field, what they found is that fertilization can actually stimulate the growth and the reproduction of the consumers that eat them. So not only does it impact the animals like grasshoppers, but it might impact the birds and other things that are eating the grasshoppers.
Wow, this is really cool. But what does this have to do with locusts in terms of sustainability? We've gotten really into like carbon and nitrogen and locusts, but like locusts and sustainability, how does this relate?
So we had an interview with the most amazing locust expert in the entire world, Dr. Ariane Cease, last time. And one of the species that she studies in her lab is the Asian locust, which is this huge pest of grasslands in northern Asia. And what she discovered is that this species in particular likes a high carbon, low protein diet.
Which she calls the donut diet.
Yeah, as opposed to the Atkins diet where you're like, I'm eating lots of protein and not very many carbs. These guys are like junk food addicts, right? They're just eating carbs. That's the diet to which they're physiologically adapted. When the only food available is low carb and high protein, these guys have a really hard time surviving and reproducing. So their population density is really, really low. And remember what happens when locusts' population density increases?
Oh, then they turn into gregarious locusts.
Yeah, and they start to form swarms, right?
And that's when they become a problem.
Right. A key to preventing locust swarms in the grasslands is if the food that's available is higher in protein and lower in carbs. So under those conditions, they'll have a low population density and they'll stay solitary and they'll just go about their business, eating the things that are available to them, trying to make a living and then not bothering anybody.
So we're talking about the donut diet versus the Atkins diet. And so the locust prefers the donut diet. So they're a lot like, I don't know, some of my relatives. And whereas I am more on the like, oh, let's eat more vegetables, maybe more like the Atkins diet. And so what happens is I keep making all these wonderful foods and they're all like really high in protein, really yummy. And then my, donut addicted family comes in and they're like, I can't eat this. And then half of them leave.
Yeah, that's exactly like the locusts.
So then they don't turn gregarious and swarm the country.
Oh, you're making a link between food and gregariousness. Yes. I got you.
So some of them leave.
Being a solitary person myself, I was unable to interpret that analogy. So Ariane found that when sheep are allowed to overgraze an area in Mongolia, this results in grasslands that are high in carbon and low in protein.
Like donuts.
Yeah, it creates a grassland that is full of donuts. Not literal donuts, people, but donut-like grass. And that's the preferred food for the Asian locust. So when that high carbon, low protein diet becomes more available, if that's the way that 90% of the grass is, high in carbon, low in nitrogen, then the locust population increases and increases and increases until they reach plague proportions, until they reach the gregarious, the numbers that make them gregarious, and they become swarming plague locusts.
So what I think is interesting about this is that in Ariane's research, it shows that it's linked to what the locusts like to eat. Whereas, so when I think of this in a logical way that is not backed fully by science, I'm thinking grass, or sheep overgrazing, so low food. So I'm thinking the locusts come in, they're there, there's not enough food, so that's why they swarm to go looking for food. But that's not actually the case here. It's like the opposite. It's like they don't have enough food, or they don't have enough of their favorite food, and so then there's just less of them, which then doesn't create a swarm.
Right. So it's not that they're swarming because they're being pushed out of ideal habitat. It's that the overgrazing is somehow creating this ideal food source, and that increases their population numbers to the point where they become gregarious and start to swarm. So put yourself in the shoes of a sheep farmer in Mongolia, right? You've got to have a big enough flock to support yourself and your family. And that means that you're going to have lots and lots of sheep grazing on your land. That's going to result in low nitrogen, high carbon foods. And that means that you're going to have locust swarms.
So the idea for the sheep farmer is that if they add another sheep to their flock, that will make one, that's adding to your profit because it's one whole animal more that you can sell. Maybe there'll be a benefit to the farmer because they add another sheep, but really there's kind of this negative impact to all the farmers and to everyone for adding the extra sheep.
Right. So there's tension between needing to have a large flock of sheep grazing on your land so that you can support your family, and the impact of having locust swarms devastating food resources in your community.
Right.
And that's a real problem. So how do you think people typically want to solve this problem?
With pesticides.
Yeah, that's typically what people want to do, is they just want to blanket the area with pesticides. And that's not a good solution because oftentimes pesticides are very expensive. They can have impacts on human and animal health. So what if it's making your family or the animals that you need to survive sick? And then there's also a lot of negative impact on the environment. Not only will it kill the locusts that are causing you a problem, but it might also kill beneficial insects or birds or other organisms in the community.
Right.
You might also try using fertilizers, like adding nitrogenous fertilizer to your grasslands. And Ariane's research has indicated that that does have some benefit, and that does in fact work to keep the locust populations down. But that's also pretty expensive, and then also impacts the environment because that nitrogen can run off into streams and rivers. It causes eutrophication and has problems in other ways.
It's interesting. This is exactly what I was thinking with when I visited the Salton Sea, because of the agriculture runoff that goes into the Salton Sea is filled with pesticides and fertilizers. Once the sea retracts and dries up, then the dirt, which is filled with these pesticides, then becomes dried out and becomes dust. So it's like toxic dust being re-released.
So Ariane has proposed this really interesting approach to solving this locust problem that may help farmers avoid locust plagues without having to use lots of pesticides and without having to use fertilizers. What do you think she did?
I am guessing that she proposed to remove some of the sheep.
Exactly. And we're not talking about cutting the population of the sheep by 50% or anything radical like that. We're talking about maybe a small reduction in the number of sheep that are grazing on every acre. And that actually results in preventing the nitrogen depletion of the grasslands. So the result is that grasses still have their natural protein, high protein, low carb ratio. And that increases the mortality of the locusts so they don't ever become a huge population, and that prevents swarms.
So what I think is interesting about this as well is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that the sheep ended up being healthier. And so they were able to go for an equivalent price, even having less sheep, because they were able to be fulfilled by the grass that was there, and they weren't having to compete for resources amongst themselves.
That's exactly right. And that brings us back to our biological stoichiometry. It turns out that when plants are lower in carbohydrates and higher in nitrogen, that the animals that eat them are able to grow more quickly. They have more robust bodies, they reproduce better, and they're generally healthier.
Wow.
Yeah, so
science.
It all ties together. It is science. It's fantastic.
Oh, that's
and
great.
So that's one of the real benefits of thinking about things in terms of the entire system. A more traditional scientific approach might have looked at the locust problem and just said, let's find a way to kill them all.
Right. Kind of like what we were talking about with mosquitoes.
Yeah, by using pesticides. But a sustainability approach means using systems thinking. And so looking at all of the different causes and factors that are involved in this problem and coming up with a solution that works for everybody.
And it's wild to me that this did work for everybody, because I think that there's a misconception in sustainability that in order to have a sustainable world, a lot of people will have to give up a lot of things, that there can be win-win solutions. I think it would be interesting. I wonder, so we're talking about livestock management, but how do you approach that? How do you even talk to Mongolian farmers to get them to implement this? How do you make all this make sense to someone and then get them to act?
Yeah, and I guess that's why that's a nice way to connect sustainability problems to wicked problems, because it turns out that this isn't, even though the solution, decreasing sheep populations might sound very simple, enacting it is actually quite difficult, right?
Right.
So communicating to people and educating farmers about why this works might be challenging. There might be communication breakdowns. It may seem like such a preposterous idea to have to grow fewer sheep and actually still be able to get the same amount of money because your sheep are in higher quality, right, that they don't ever want to do it.
Not to mention the cultural implications of Western researchers talking to Mongolian farmers about what they should do to their crops.
Right. If somebody came into my house and told me how I needed to decorate my cookies, for example, I might not want to do it that way.
Right, exactly. And so I think it's really important to, and it's interesting you said, they might have communication breakdown. I'm just going to go ahead and say that I think they expect to have communication breakdown, and you expect these things to take a long time and to be really hard to implement.
So next week what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit more about the way in which Ariane has gone about engaging stakeholders for that community to try to implement some of her sustainable solutions to the locust problem.
Right. I'm excited.
Me too.
I think we're going to learn a lot.
Yes, it's going to be fun.
Awesome. See y'all next week.
Bye-bye.